Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this first interview of the year, and welcome to already our 10th season of Room for Discussion. Yesterday, our guest of today, Robbert Dijkgraaf, spoke in the opening of the academic year of the University of Amsterdam. And there he said that the days we're living in right now are the best days for science. However, these days are also the worst. And that is exactly what we are going to discuss today in Room for Discussion. What are the internal problems in the scientific community? Why is there a growing distrust in science? But maybe better, how can we overcome the distrust? How can we restore those internal problems? And how can we cause that this period is the best period for science? We all welcome you to join this discussion. You can ask your questions by Leonard, or join us on Twitter by using hashtag RFD. We are very pleased that we can have this discussion with one of the Dutch most renowned scientists, a world-class physicist, a popularizer of science, a university professor here at the University of Amsterdam, and the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. A round of applause for Robbert Dijkgraaf.
Mr. Dijkgraaf, welcome on my behalf as well. You've had a very busy schedule these days. You were yesterday at the opening of the academic year and the day before at Tuschinski to share your passion for science. But what maybe is less known about you is that you also went to the Rietveld Academy for the Arts.
Yes.
And so many people see the arts and sciences as two distinguished worlds. Do you see them as compatible?
I do, and in fact, often people say, well, you made this big detour. So I got my bachelor degree in physics, then lost interest, went to art school to study painting, and then basically lost interest and got back into physics. So it looks like a big detour. But often I say, for me, it was actually a shortcut to become a researcher.
Okay.
Because during my physics education, it was all about knowledge, you know, doing the test, and I had like perfect scores. But I kind of lost the passion to that was originally driving me.
Yes.
And at art school, you are forced to explore. You know, you make sketches. It's like just make materials. And at the end of the week, the only thing that counted, did you have a big stack of sketches, not whether they were good or bad. And so when I finally decided my career was in science, I think, well, I want to preserve that attitude. And since then, I've always been advising students, so it's not about getting the best results, it's making it your own. And you can only do this by tracing your own footsteps, finding your own path. So even the familiar material, you have to kind of make it yourself by going on this path of exploration. So the remarkable thing for me, art was the way into physics research.
So you also say that you have to create too in art. And can we say that also in science you can create?
Of course, science is a creative process. It's one of the few things that is always growing and getting better. Now, even if you have a failed project, you learn something. You learn this is not the case.
Yeah.
It's one thing which is only growing, and it's a creative process because always by definition, you're at the frontiers of knowledge.
Okay.
Of your own knowledge, of those perhaps of society, and so you always are staring into this kind of unknown. And the question is, how do you deal with it? And well, you have to kind of jump in, and that's the creative process.
Yeah. You currently work as the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton,
Yes.
not to mistake in Princeton University.
No, it's independent.
It's independent, yeah,
Yes.
and many describe that as a really idyllic place in the realm of science. What makes this?
I think it is. It's one of the few places where you feel, I personally feel, it's the place I dreamt of when I was like a young kid. How the scientific environment should be, a scholarly environment. And I think it's because it truly tries to stay like in the spirit of what scientific research is. So, which I think for us means two things, getting people who are really good, really passionate, and then get out of the way. It's just, I often joke, I provide the rarest of natural resources, but just not oil or gas, but it's free space and time. And
that
I think
results also in no deadlines.
no deadlines.
Pressure to publish.
We have no evaluations. People don't believe us.
Yeah.
You say, well, aren't you evaluating your scholars? Well, we do that in advance. When you get a job.
I think that sounds for many professors and scientists here like a dream. Is that
It's a
then?
dream, but it's also a nightmare because it's a life without excuses.
Yeah.
And we all know we are busy, busy, busy. But it's nice to be busy because you have an excuse why you don't do certain things.
Yeah.
And if you say, well, you have every possibility, you have all the space, all the time, you can now do brilliant work, that's like kind of a lot of pressure. So no pressure is in some sense maximum pressure. And there's some people who literally say, I don't want to be there. It's too much.
I need structure. And
I don't want to be paid to do nothing because I have one mathematician who said, I feel I have to prove a great theorem every day.
Yeah. But on the other hand, there are also a lot of scientists saying nowadays that if you an immense pressure to create as much publications as they can. We also heard our rector saying yesterday that we live in a hyper-competitive atmosphere.
Yes.
Do you think that that pressure does diminish the quality of scientific work?
Well, I do. I think, that's the wrong kind of pressure. I'm just talking about the pressure of no pressure, which is like internal.
I know, but on the other hand,
I think that's
the
the external pressure. No, I think if you literally look at what's been happening in the world over the past decades, I think these kind of external pressures, the way we are counting things, not weighing their importance, there are lots of kind of metrics that keep track of how you do.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, as you say, like studying for the test. If you know what test you're going to do, you know what you want to learn. But it's not actually learning the field. So people are going to play the system.
Yeah.
If you say, and there are like bizarre examples of that.
Can you call?
Well, for instance,
do you have an example?
Extreme examples are in China, where if you get at certain universities, you get a publication in Science in Nature, you double your salary.
Yeah.
If another one, it doubles again, and another one. So then if you earn 8 times as much, the next year if you don't have one, it gets halved again. So what happens there, the people, once they are accepted, their publication is accepted, but it isn't yet printed, you find advertisements saying, well, do you want to be a co-author because I can offer you a paper in Nature.
But those examples.
So that's kind of, it's almost like illegal traffic in organs or something. It feels it's in that category, It's like you can buy a scientific reputation. And it's an extreme example, but we see this here too. And the remarkable thing is that all these mechanisms by which we like scientifically keep track of people's productivity, people's output, I mean, they, to a large extent, are self-inflicted. So many of them have been developed by scientists themselves, some of them economists,
for example,
some of them
Hirsch
physicists.
index or something
The
like
Hirsch
that,
index is a famous example, and my favorite story, so if those of you know, it's called the H index, and it basically keeps track how many publications of how many citations. And in certain fields, particularly I think in the medical field, they're very proud. So I've had people introduced to me, hi, I'm Mr. So-and-so, my H index is 73. No, it's like, what?
Okay, welcome.
And I have this one physicist, Edward Witten, who's a professor on my institute, and I think in the physical sciences, he's the scientist with the highest H index in the world. And I once asked him, do you know what an H index is? And he had no clue. So it's bizarre. It's like somebody has the gold medal in the Olympics and has never heard about the Olympics.
But it seems that we're now in a sort of a vicious cycle. We need to publish to get cited, and only if we have enough citations, we get funding.
Yes.
How can we break that vicious cycle? What is needed?
I think there's a discussion around this, and I'll be honest, like here in the Netherlands, there are many voices. Internationally, I think people are starting to complain. There are so many things wrong. Now, first of all, I think it provokes kind of perverse behavior because people take an article, they split it in 10. Certain fields are, if you're like a biologist, you might publish, say, 20, 50 articles a year. If you're a mathematician, you might publish one a year.
Yeah.
Certainly, you know, that's fine in mathematics. If you start to compare the two, the apples and oranges, then you know, it's like the humanities, social sciences are usually in a very bad position. So I think we are. It's difficult because we rely on it a lot, and so I think what we have to come in its place is, in some sense, a much more all-round evaluation what research is about, and in some sense, we have to kind of wean ourselves from all these kind of nice metrics. And you have to be honest, because if you have to pass judgment on a certain scientific field which is not yours, then you might check, you know, how many citations this person.
There
I
is
mean,
some
it's very
structure
tempting.
needed, yeah.
So the remarkable thing is that for those that we do not know well, we use kind of these metrics.
Yeah.
By those we know well, we use very other things. So we start to have a discussion, or you ask your friends or colleagues. So I think it's, you know, I think in some sense we should bring back the human dimension and try not to be too scientific in evaluating our own scientific research.
But we also see that this vicious cycle is mainly gets its fuel from money, actually. And we just had 1 week ago the report essay from José van Dijk, who is the head now of the Royal Society for Arts and Science, which states that there should be more investment from private companies. Is there
well, I
a
think in
solution
general,
to
I
this?
think one thing which they mark, and the Royal Academy makes a very strong point, and a point I've been making before many times, is that if you look at scholarships, scientific research in the Netherlands, we do very well on a quality basis. So in many ways you can argue that the quality of Dutch research is, you know, it's number 1 or 2 in the world. But the amount, the quantity is very low. And in some sense we have this high quality, you could say, because we just only take the very good researchers, and in some sense we are not distributing enough. And so you really should make the case that, you know, the Dutch are underfunded. Not compared to some crazy country, but countries like Germany, the UK, the Scandinavian countries.
That was what she called out for. We need more funding of private companies.
Well, I think two ways. If you look at the public money, so the money the government is giving, that's already under par. So we should do more.
That was also where you lobbied very strongly for.
I think, you know, there are some, you know, the question what is enough, but there are certain targets, and it's even going down. The other thing is that the Netherlands has not that much private R&D investment compared to other countries. Part of that is because we have different kind of industry. Like, for instance, we don't have the car companies or the heavy industry that you find in Sweden or Germany. But part of it also because our companies are not doing well on investing in knowledge. And if they do so, often they do it in other countries and not here.
But we also see that when the companies invest in universities, such as in Rotterdam at the School of Management, they like Shell, it influences the way academia is done. So
that's true. So one thing you see that companies are not very strong on funding basic research, fundamental knowledge, and, you know, independent. In fact, what has been happening over the years is that many of that more applied research they kind of stopped doing, and that shifted into the university. So universities not only have to cover basic research, but then they also have to cover a large extent the much more applied one. So that kind of crowding out the basic research, and I think actually the essence, namely the autonomy of universities to kind of set research agendas, not influenced by companies or governments.
No, because it is a conflict of interests if those companies invest in research where they also want the outcomes already. What should be done to not have that conflict of interest, but still have private companies investing in research?
Well, I mean, in some sense we do pretty good in the Netherlands. I think, you know, it's just, you know, it's independent. So if they should just very clearly, you know, they could fund it or help fund it. But then the process should be independent. So researchers should be independent to find the conclusions. And This is true for companies, but it's also true, by the way, for non-profits, philanthropic money. Like a lot of medical research is being sponsored by like the cancer fund or something. And now clearly these patients would like to see their disease solved. So they have pressure too. But now the researchers should always be independent, and universities should make clear that that they can accept the money, but there's no influence on the outcome.
So how can we take away this influence from the money? Because if they fund, they still want a certain way that the research has to be done. So
well, I think you're pointing to the correct point of view, that in some sense, if you look at universities and their research budget, it's to a large extent, of course, now external. It comes from external sources, whether it's like government money, private money, companies, foundations, etc. And now one thing which has been slowly diminished is the capability of universities to fund their own research. I mean, a big difference, for instance, between the University of Amsterdam and say Princeton University, which has a lot of, a large endowment from which they kind of, can support many. Roughly, they get the whole budget of the University of Amsterdam on top of whatever they have from their own endowment, that they can actually be independent and set their own research agenda. And that's something where universities become more and more difficult. So they are forced to live according to this kind of external rules.
However, we also see that that's the matching principle that some private companies or even the government says, well, we want to invest in this research. However, we only invest if the university is also putting in the same amount of money. And then you even see that some faculties say, well, we can't have that investment because we can't put in that amount of money.
That's a big difference between the Netherlands and, say, the United States. In the United States, we have the idea of overhead. So you give somebody like $1 million to €1 to do research. The university says, well, that's fine, but I want to have 60% on top of it. Because, I have to pay for the buildings, have to pay for the cafeteria, I have to have lab assistants, etc. And so that in some sense, you don't have to put extra money in here. Here we do not have that principle. So you get money, but you have to, the university has to build the buildings, build the labs, have the secretaries, etc. So in some sense, it's what you say, a poisonous gift. You get this grant money, but you have to match often almost one-to-one with your own funds. So in some sense, it's external. I think universities are, particularly Dutch universities, have not much autonomy in setting their own agenda compared to other universities around the world.
So then the alternative that you propose is the government funding, mainly that you receive more funds from the government, or is that the only alternative?
I think that if you're honest and you look at the major component for research at universities, I think it should be coming from the government. I think, particularly because universities have a very important role for basic research. This will not happen in industry laboratories. In some sense, you have the independent, the breadth, the depth of research across all fields. And I think we have to be honest that that kind of research is a public good. If you invest in understanding the fundamental structure of matter or the brain or history, whatever the profits will be, they cannot be tapped, not even by this university. It will be a public good. Everybody will make use of it. So since it's a public good, it should be publicly supported. And so I understand why companies are not supporting research in like philosophy, because they will never capture any goods.
But also the government decides where the funds will be allocated to, and then therefore giving prosperity to certain areas of certain sciences.
I think that is a danger. So what you see is a certain drift where governments become more and more enamored by kind of top-down mechanisms, right? So there's like they feel, well, we have to make a strategic decisions what is important for the Netherlands. So
they maybe look too short-term as well.
Yeah, and again, I think our strategy should be to be a knowledge base for everything. And not make decide in advance in which directions you want to go. I mean, to some extent, yes. But it's very important to have a good balance between the two. And I've seen, even in the 25 years I've been now a professor here, really a shift towards more top-down structure. And so you get a feeling. And I often had that feeling myself. You know, I'm interested in fundamental physics and math. I was never in any of these categories. So you look at the agenda and you see, oh, these are the important. I'm not there.
No.
So what does that mean?
So it seems like there's also sort of inequality growing within science there.
Yeah, there is. And there honestly is. And in fact, you know, to be very frank, certain of these fields that we all feel are important, they are almost overfunded. No? If both Europe and the Netherlands and the city and the funding agencies all decide, well, the future is, you know, this and this cancer research, and you are this poor researcher, then you get too much money. Literally, some of them have too much money, and that's a waste too.
Yes. So I think it's time for audience questions.
Yes.
Are there any audience questions on the internal problems that we just discussed that you want to address to Robbert? Leonard, over there, I see one hand. Yes.
So yeah, I think the discussion you just had is a quite interesting one, because what you're saying is that science should be funded by public goods or by public funds because it's a public good. But the question with providing a public fund to for a public good is that this public good should be relevant for the public.
Yes.
And of course, there you have those lists of which science fields one should or one thinks is relevant, and you have this list of sciences which we think are not that relevant for us now. Whose job is it to prove the relevance of the sciences which should be funded by public goods?
Oh, that's an absolutely important and brilliant question. So what is the distribution? So one thing I think is we know, looking backwards, that investing in certain fundamental fields which look like totally irrelevant were crucial. If you think about, you know, the way the computer has been done, because, okay, there were some logicians thinking about, you know, can we structure. The DNA was not found by people who want to solve a disease. It were just, they were fundamentally interested, what's the structure of the DNA molecule? So we know some of these things play out in the long term. And it's very difficult for the public or the government or politicians to make that judgment. So I often feel it's a little bit like financial investments. You have like an investment portfolio. You want a few long shots that might pay out tremendously. And you have some more short term. So there's a good balance between long term and short term. And how do you make these decisions? I think particularly for the long term investments, I think in some sense the responsibility first and foremost is within the scientific society itself. Now, if I ask mathematicians, okay, so who are the mathematicians that really have deep ideas that they typically know, that people have a track record. And so, this is really exciting. We don't know where it's going. It feels deep. It feels important. And one thing I noticed that in some sense we don't have any kind of metrics to think about that. So if you're a financial investor, you have a certain risk portfolio, how your risk is distributed, and how one risk might be kind of hedged with another risk. In some sense, we think in a much more naive way about our research portfolios. And what I see is that because most of the mechanisms are, okay, I'm funding you for 5 years or for 3 years. So you have to indicate what you do in 3 and 5 years. But there are things that take 50 years. Yeah. And so somebody should take the responsibility. And I think the government should do that. Now, if we have a plan to raise our dikes for the next 100 years because we are worried about climate change, in the same way we have to make in-depth investments to make sure when the next revolution comes, and who knows where it will be. It will be in brain science, will it be, in certain fields in the social sciences, we don't know. That at least we have covered our bases, and there are people who are, are able to follow that. So I think it's always it feels like a very politician's answer, but there should be a right balance. But I think you should have a discussion. And what I've seen consistently over the years, that this portfolio is tilting towards the more short-term, safe bets, and we get a lot of replication. So it's one thing that you are ignoring the long tail, where really big transformations can take place. It's also a waste to have many people doing the same thing in the safe middle.
We will take another question. Is there Leonard over here?
Hi, thank you. It was really interesting. I have a question actually, and I think it suits well with what was just being said. Because you said, I think a lot of funding should come from the government. But universities should have more autonomy, and scientists should have more autonomy to decide what they want to research. But what you do see, especially in the Netherlands, is that a lot of the bigger parties, especially the ones that are making government right now, they're very much focused on some kind of economical incentive, what you also talked about.
Yes.
And you also see with the new chairman of the how do you say it, the collaboration of universities, the
Phase nu. Yes.
Yeah, the phase nu. Their chairman is also from one of these parties,
yes.
as you probably know. So I'm really wondering, how do you see the future and how do you see this developing? Because I think it's a really great ideal, but how do you see that
Well, so first of all, I should say, as we said, if you look at countries that do well, they have a lot of research that's more directed towards companies, etc. But in fact, it's privately sponsored. So, like in Germany, so we give our total R&D budget is 2% of GDP. In Germany, 3%. If you see what makes the biggest difference, well, the government is more supportive, but also industries do almost double what they do here. So a lot of that can be done by industries themselves. So I don't think it's the government or the public money's task to help separate industries or certain branches of industry. So I see why these parties want to stimulate that research, but they should direct themselves first and foremost, I think, towards these companies. They should kind of be more they should build labs, and they should hire scientists, etc. And I think it's this kind of economic thinking. I'm totally subscribing it. In fact, I just mentioned that the European Union calculated that if you spend extra money in R&D, that the economic growth that will come out of it is roughly a factor 5 to 7 of what you spend. So you can argue that investments in knowledge pay off. They pay off tremendously, with 5 to 7. That's tremendous. However, I think this is one thing that we have to guard these politicians is the short-term thinking. By saying, well, if we invest only in things that obviously have an immediate application, that is the most economic way to do so, because it's like it's doing the safe bets, and they will never pay off these big things. And if you look at technologies that totally transform countries, you also have to, so I think that you need a lot of advocacy to explain to politicians that their intentions are fine, but they should force themselves to think long term.
Thank you for your question.
I hope that was a good answer.
Yes.
If we go on to this more, internal problems, we see these problems with publication pressure. We had a discussion about funding, but what we also see is a discussion, especially in the social sciences, by the over-specialization of the scientist. That the scientist is looking in a too narrow view to his own discipline and forgets what's out there in the world.
Right.
Do you see that as a problem? Do you acknowledge that as a problem?
I think yes and no. I think one thing that you have to avoid is talking about the ideal scholar. Because now that's like talking about the ideal musician.
Yeah.
Who should be playing both the violin, the trumpet, etc. You have these one-man orchestras. They're pathetic. So we know the solution is the symphony orchestra, right? So there are many different roles, I think, that we as an academic community have to do. So we have to go both in depth. We have to understand the societal we have to communicate with the. But luckily, this shouldn't be one person do it all. So we should have. That's what the economists found. distribution of labor. There are various roles to play, and they should play this kind of in harmony. So I do feel there's a certain risk if you all become entirely specialized. So
Which
it
is
should
a bit
also
the
be
trend
possible.
we're going on to, isn't
I
it?
think it's yes, in the sense that that if you look at the current, again, research funding, careers, etc., they are often, very narrow.
Yeah.
And I think it's up to us. This is not something that we can blame governments.
No.
It's actually, it's the scientific community to make clear that there is, very exciting fields. Honestly, if you look at what's happening, if you say what's the really exciting research that's being done, I think one thing we see is often done in teams.
Yeah,
It's about
interdisciplinary.
topics,
yeah.
if you think about the cell or something, you have chemists and you have biologists and you have computer scientists and mathematicians. They're all. So I think actually if you look at what the current research is being done, that there's a lot of like interdisciplinarity, etc. So, but I think sometimes the funding schemes, the career path, the way we think about it, as you say, organizations should follow the tracks of people, not the other way around.
But what you're also saying is with that interdisciplinary, we have a better grasp of the world around us, or we can take bigger steps.
Yeah, but often I think it's a little bit of a cliche. People think like it's the T profile, so you have to go depth in at least in one area to know what it means to be wrong, so to say, and then also connect. But some people, and I know wonderful scientists who they dig deeper and deeper than anybody else, and please keep digging, because they might find the diamond that we're all looking for.
Yeah.
And others, they're terrific in bringing people together. So I'm a great believer in kind of biodiversity, also in the academic community, and we shouldn't kind of have cookie cutter scientists and scholars. We should actually actively promote people to find their own ways. But it's true, I think if you go in the past, and some people, the model of I remember myself when I was president of the academy, again I was a physicist, and I remember there was like a big event in biology, and I gave a speech, and I get like this email from a famous biologist. They say, Robert, I understand you're now also an expert in biology, and so you have to allow a certain kind of, I would say, kind of amateurism. That nobody's looking for a thought piece. Certainly not within the academy.
Yeah. Well, another thing that I would like to address is also seen in the over-specialization in the social sciences that we have to deal with a huge confirmation bias.
Yes.
That we deal with with these big data sets that always in some way, there's always some answer to our hypothesis.
Yes.
And I found a great example. There was a study, a meta-analysis of Daniel Fanelli in 2010, where they found that economists are 88% of the times they found their predictions that they were right, and it was 5 times higher than hard scientists.
Yes.
Is this confirmation bias within the social science not also a very structural problem?
Well, I have to be careful to say it, but I think the social sciences, it's very important for every field, but particularly I think for the social sciences. Now, there's this phenomena called physics envy. Everybody wants to be like a physicist because, not that they have such glamorous lives, but that at least, I know why, because physics is simple. Thinking about an electron or two is much simpler than studying society. So you have this immense complexity. And if you try to only capture it in equations as we have done so successfully in physics, I think you're missing part of it. And there is also the more reflective part. And so it's very important for every field, to come into your strength. And I think in the social science, one thing that you have to live with is that the answers will probably be complicated. There probably won't be like a equivalent of an Einstein's equations or something, and particularly economists have to worry about that because it's very tempting to go into kind of put all your belief into mathematics, but it might only bring you so far.
But don't we also see that they do not try to falsify what they're theorizing, because since they have huge amounts of data sets, they accumulate all the data they need in order to verify
everything,
that you can prove everything. Isn't that something that they're missing while trying to become a hard science? That's what they're trying to
Well,
do?
I think so, but I think actually, I mean, the one thing, the great thing, if you go, particularly in the tradition of the social science and also economics, is that, again, there's also a fine tradition of being self-critical and reflective. So I think that's part of the solution. Also, I think within the social science, I'm sometimes amazed about the different kind of the differences within the social science.
Yeah.
No, honestly, I think, and by the way, the humanities have the same problem. Scientists, whatever you think, you know, and of course, when we are competing for money, you have the physicist against the chemist again. But in the end, you know, we all find common ground, which might be because of the scientific method, you know, the way we all kind of based on math. Within the social science, if you compare anthropologists or psychologists or economists or sociologists, the way they treat data, huge differences.
Yeah.
And in humanities too, in humanities celebrate the differences and not the thing that they have in common. So I think there's a great challenge here to bring the social sciences together.
Well,
and I think actually, I mean, probably, you know, the different ways in which you start educating something, I think very good initiatives.
But what you stated as well is that they envy the hard sciences,
Yes.
and especially we see it in economics. We try to put everything in mathematical models and then predict the future.
Yes.
However, we've also have seen that those predictions are not always right.
Right, because people don't behave like the models.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then wouldn't we say that the social sciences, and in this case the economics, deserve less authority in predicting the future?
Well, I don't know. I think there is something remarkable, of course, and I have to be very careful here. But you know, if you look at, now in physics, we now we have grand theories, and then sometimes there are observations, and then you know your theory is wrong.
Yeah.
If I just look what happened in the last 10 years, so we had, of course, the financial crisis of 2008, and I would say like the political crisis of 2016, what happened in the world, you know, in terms of elections. So I think both for the economists and for political scientists, I think these would be two wake-up calls, right? Because didn't really see them coming, and you know, the theory wasn't there. So I think these are good occasions to revisit your field and see, you know, perhaps we should have a more you know, historical view, or so I think they are very exciting fields because they're hugely relevant, and but you know, clearly there are still some things which weren't on the radar screen. And I think on the other hand, so some belief in mathematics I think should be there, but then there are some other fields. Take for instance the life sciences. It's a huge field too. Biologists. No, they also love to use mathematical equations, etc., but they're very much aware of the limits.
Yeah.
And so the
Are we then
remarkable
not
thing,
sometimes the social science is a bit too overconfident?
I think so. It's remarkable that life scientists, who are in some sense much closer to physicists, have great skepsis about mathematical models, because they say, honestly, they say, well, we're dealing, you know, with this kind of car engine that evolution built, and not in any rational way.
Yeah.
It wasn't designed, it just happened by accident, 4 billion years of evolution.
Yeah.
And so they like car mechanics, they open and they look. They're not looking for a grand, like Newton's equations for life sciences, so they're very suspicious about mathematical methods, I think rightly so.
Yeah.
It's sometimes remarkable to see the economists, which I think study something even more complicated than the human body, are so confident that they will find a mathematical foundation.
We have a very interesting study from TEDlog who looked at all the predictions that of economists and social scientists, and that actually their predictions were mostly not, they didn't happen, the predictions. So
Well, they were even negatively correlated.
I'll give you one anecdote, and again, I love economists, etc. You know, as I said, it's extremely important, but just there's another risk too, which is that I think once went to a talk, and my colleague, he studies like these kind of medieval cults, etc., astrology, etc., and he said, well, economists have to be careful that it's not like astrology, in the sense we would say it's not science, but you can call it hyper-science, in the sense that you believe the science so much that you start to live according to your theory instead the other way around. And you know, I think there are certain fields which have a certain risk there, because if you, of course, the economy is also controlled by all kind of mechanisms, you know, there are central banks, etc. And so you have to be very careful that you're not kind of No, astrology also works. If you joke, if you need 10 human sacrifices in order that the sun rises, it always works, right? But it's not something you should do. So there's a certain risk, honestly, with science in general, that we take it too serious, because you always have to keep an open mind.
But this way of trying to always predict the future, especially in the economists, isn't that also one of the reasons why there's such a distrust in science? Because the predictions that have been made various times haven't been confirmed, actually. Like, many thought that Trump wouldn't win the elections, or Brexit wouldn't happen, and at the end they happened, and that isn't that also a reason why...
I feel personally, because I think I was on the phone on some radio program here the day before the election, and my good friend of mine is Sam Wang. He's at Princeton. He's a neuroscientist, but he does election predictions, and he said the chance that Trump would win was less than 1%. And I love him. He's a terrific scientist. He's a very good neuroscientist. I'm doubting his polling skills now. And in fact, he said that if Trump would win, he would eat a bug. So the next day he was on CNN eating a cockroach. So and very, very serious. So, but there is this thing that we have to be careful that we always indicate our levels of uncertainty, etc. And I noticed, and in fact I once gave a course with students, and we looked at climate change, and we looked at climate scientists, their papers, and how they were on television, where they were asked questions. And it was remarkable that when they were interviewed, their statements were certainly like 10 times as strong. Because it's very easy to do, right? It's like you feel you're selling something. So you have to need a soundbite. You feel you want to influence people, so you're not going to tell all the uncertainties, but you should. There should be honesty in advertisement.
Exactly, and that's selling ID, and especially when the scientists are not right. That could be a really fruitful ground for distrust in science as well.
I must say, just in general, that there's a lot of talk about distrust in science. I think there's a development, there's a lot of distrust, lack of confidence. I think scientists are doing relatively well. Depends a little bit which area. I think medical doctors are doing even better. Like journalists are doing really bad. So I think it's not that science as a whole is sinking. I think there's a general erosion of trust. But I think I'm very worried about this because, in some sense, science, and when I talk about science, I talk about wetenschap in Dutch. So it's all the sciences, including the social sciences and human sciences. But I think there is a certain risk because we become so relevant. And we are so interconnected that I notice one mistake could kind of percolate and influence a lot. I think I was myself very much involved when the climate science report from the IPCC came out. That was a couple of years ago. There was a famous misquote there that said that the Himalayas would melt in 2035. In fact, it was, I think, 2350. It was just literally one typo in 4,000 pages of report. But of course, it was picked out by the press. And the story was, well, if you can't trust the scientists, so we can kind of throw out the whole report, which was really silly. And then you got the discussion, well, then science in general can be thrown out the window. So we have to worry about this. And I think the risk of a major disaster in the sciences, and particularly, it's one thing if it's in climate science or economics, where there are lots of uncertainties, but think about it, something in the medical field or something, which would really impact people's lives. Or a particle accelerator that will blow up. I think that would harm the field. So since we are all in it together, I think there's a real risk in the future.
But is this trend then really seen as a new thing? Is it not of all times that scientists are, well, not always trusted?
I think that we have had ups and downs, but I do see that, certainly I think, looking back to the recent past. So, of course, like in the 1950s, 60s, just buy a magazine in that time. You will see advertisements where, there are scientists and they're looking at a glorious future, with space travel and all the modern luxuries. It was a really upbeat time. And I think, we have to regain some of that. So I think we are under threat. And one thing I think which I feel is working against us is I feel, just the general climate in which we communicate. I think, you know, it's kind of almost like a hostile environment to make your case.
Yeah.
Because you have to live with the modern ways of communicating, which are, they don't really like, people don't read 500-page scientific articles.
So hard scientists should be more on the scene and explain a little bit more how.
Yeah, well, I think we have to adapt. We have to adapt to. So I'm really an optimist. So I feel. So we can talk about, you know, social media, etc. And, you know, of course, you know, it's very difficult to adapt to, like, Twitter.
Yeah.
But then I look, you know. So at my own institute, of course, our most famous professor ever was Albert Einstein, and one thing I learned from him in Princeton is that not only he had wonderful equations, but he has all these wonderful quotations. Now, I have this book on my desk, The Ultimate Quotable Einstein. It's 500 pages about everything.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are like 1 or 2 sentences. And in fact, in his later years, he would think about these quotes, and then when he had a good one, his secretary would type it out, would cut it out, and he put it in a wooden box. And I joke, you know, he was tweeting 50 years before Twitter. Yeah. And so we have always, you know, he was a master of having the bon mot, the correct word to capture something. So I think we should adapt to the environment. But I think it's a kind of a difficult period because, you know, it's these days people live in filter bubbles. You know, newspapers are being kind of atomized in their in the little articles. There's clickbait, there's fake news, there's alternative facts, and that's a very different environment. And so I think science has to find its way.
Especially in this difficult environment, do we then not need the vision of nuanced hard scientists instead of the more overconfident social sciences?
I think we need all the sciences. I think because in some sense we are in here together. I think.
But are we not sometimes too blind with policy making on the social sciences?
Well, there is a certain risk here, and the risk is that we forget to get across what I think is the core of what science is all about. And I think, you know, I don't have the correct definition, but it's like the most systematic way to understand the world and understand ourselves. And we have a certain method for that. And I think that method we should explain more. So we should focus less on the results. I think it's wonderful, you know, I'm always jealous of our astronomy friends, because each week they find another nice planet or something. It's always in the news, you know, it's a beautiful picture with nebula. But, you know, people, okay, they're another planet. I think we should also read and understand what does it mean to search? What does it mean to make mistakes? But how do we correct ourselves? So we should talk more about the process, about what is driving us, about the passion about which we want to understand, instead of kind of being overconfident in our predictions. Because I think we should be honest that, you know, this is our best guess, perhaps, in certain situations, and, you know, don't make the case more stronger than it actually is.
Yeah. Are there audience questions on this part of the interview?
Yes.
See there.
Leonard.
Thank you. You were talking about the role of the scientists of making, giving science a better image. Of course, scientists would play a very big part in that, but shouldn't be our politicians should be play a bigger role in this? Because if you take the United States and Trump with declining the effects of the climate change, shouldn't there be a bigger role of the politicians in that?
Well, I think certainly. I think, you know, it's. I feel when, you know, when as scientists, as academics, as scholars, we want to make the case, it's important. First, we look at ourselves. What can we do? And I think we can do much more, and not everybody, but, you know, as a collective. But also, I think you need partnerships. You need partnership with the media, partnership perhaps with art, with companies, but definitely also with politicians and policymakers. But one thing you could also think about, now there are not that many politicians who have a background in, for instance, particularly like in the physical sciences. And I know a good friend of mine in Princeton, he was like a congressman. He's a physicist, he was a congressman for like 20 years. And he often told me, the last thing I did was sit on committees about science. Because, okay, actually, no, I want to sit on other committees that discuss, the military or foreign policy, because the voice of science should also be heard about other issues. I think that's what we should do. So I think, also all of us, we should, in some sense, infiltrate politics. It's important, I think, that whether it's in Parliament or in the government or in the ministries, we have people with a lot of knowledge. In fact, in the Netherlands, there's been a lot of erosion in that respect. So if you go to the ministries, you find less experts, fewer experts than we used to have. In some sense, a lot of climate politics policies are not made by the minister, but by the top civil servants. So it's very important also that people who love science, they should be motivated and encouraged to go into these subjects. And actually, you can do a lot of good by actually presenting, so to say, the knowledge base there. You need, I often say, you need a bridgehead. And so you can help build these bridgeheads from the academic community. But it's very important you have friends on the other side. And
yep.
yeah, and I think, so we should cultivate that.
Yeah.
I think also you can educate politicians, you should bring them here. I think actually this is a terrific initiative, room for discussion. You have had many great, very influential people here.
Thank you. Is that an answer to your question?
More like that,
Yes.
terrific.
Is there another question? Leonard, over here in front, this lady.
There's a lot been spoken about distrust of the scientist. But what often happens to me that I think that the distrust of the scientist comes from himself.
Mm-hmm.
He is more often, I think, occupied with the matter of how can I, in a way, make things that I am not the tovenaarsleerling, that I lose the toverwoord, the toverwoord van de tovenaarsleerling.
Yeah.
He's
losing his place, his position.
Losing faith in himself because he's like Icarus going too high. and that's a matter that is not communicated very well with the ordinary people, I think.
I'm quite sure. I think there's several things I want to say. First of all, I think one thing we, as an academic community, as scientists, have to be very careful to wish for a past that never was. Right? We often, I think, well, I want to be left totally, no interference, just I can do whatever I want, have a safe job, etc. Like the old days. Well, that wasn't like that in the old days. I find it often very interesting to see that people, when they were like in the 19th century or the 1930s or 50s, they were in the same way. They had to fight for their money, they had to advocate, so, I mean, being in academics was always about interacting with society, etc. And so there is a certain trend, perhaps you're pointing to that, but we feel entitled to be left alone and just
be in our ivory tower.
In our ivory tower. And I think that ivory tower has never been in the way we think about it. But there are some places like that. So people joke, the institute at Princeton, we are the penthouse in the ivory tower. But it's so I think that's important. That this is in some sense also, perhaps you're pointing to that. There should be also an attitude where we are not afraid to interact with society, with politicians, to make the case. And this has always been part of our lives.
Yeah.
I think, a certain overconfidence in science is, I think it's also, I'm very much touched by it. The fact that we feel that we think we can understand the universe, that's hubris.
Yes.
How could we, we're just like a slightly improved ape, and why would we understanding the universe, the Big Bang or something, we might be just very limited. But, time and again, we have been extremely successful in that.
Yeah.
And you can worry that we aim too high, but you should also worry that you aim too low.
And I think then we come back to what you said yesterday, that these days are the best days for science.
Yes.
But what should we change in our architecture, in our infrastructure of science to make these really the best days?
Well, I think, we have to, why is it the best day? So one thing I think is now that we are, I think the number of challenges, questions that we can now address, in my own field, really, okay, what is the connection between the smallest particles and the largest structures in the universe? We understand the brain, we understand the cell, we can build basically any material we know. We have this huge amount of data now in the social sciences. Humanities can look further. Never ever we have seen all the cultures there. So it's the perfect space. I think nobody would like to go back 50 years and have these no computers, limited data, It's clearly the best of time. Also, I think we have never had so many talents. Honestly, like just in the last few decades, whole continents came online. Whole Asia, Africa, Latin America, they all started to join. So there's so many different perspectives. So the thing is that we have to build in terms of an architecture, we have to build a building where there's room for everyone. I think that's the big question. The question is, we brought so many people in, we have to find space for that. So I think this is the moment where academia should grow. It is growing, perhaps not so much here as across the world. And we have to build the architecture so that it's ideally suited to have these complicated problems which are often of a multidisciplinary nature.
And do you think we're able to build this infrastructure?
Well, it's a big challenge. So one thing I feel is that we are very innovative and creative in our thinking about our research. But are we also innovative and creative in thinking about our institutions? And do we dare to be flexible? And I think this is, by the way, also a very interesting question for students. Because I think I once said that, don't take me wrong, but I noticed that students often, they are quite conservative because they think, the university should stay as it is. Now, the great thing is that universities, so there's this famous quote that if you look at, I think, like all institutions that are still around, that were there, I think, in the year 1600. There are like 120 of them. And it's like the Vatican and the British Parliament and a few of these things. And there are like 85 universities among them. So they have survived 6, 7, 8 centuries by always adapting. Nobody would recognize the university of the 12th century. So we always are growing and changing. And it's an organic process. But we should adapt. The founding director of the Institute for Advanced Study, Abraham Flexner, his favorite word was plastic. In the 1930s, plastic meant flexible. No, you adapt. And we should be innovative, and we have new ways of thinking. And one thing I love, by the way, of American universities, that they are always continuously trying to improve. So there's this unrest that you always want to grow and change.
So what should we students then do for making this change happen and this adaptation to a new system?
Keep an open mind. Voice your and very important for universities. What the role of student is, actually, you vote with your feet, by what you're going to do, what you find interesting, and one thing I noticed, for instance, if you talk about what we talked in the beginning, the role of basic research. So I feel there are these tremendous challenges. But this is a moment to really also go into the depth. Really take this serious, not be superficial. The university should be the places where there's the deepest thinking. If there are other places where people think deeper, then this should not be called a university. That should be called a university. So, and often I feel the younger generation, they understand this. They are really intensely curious and passionate to understand things at a deep level. So you should articulate this. If governments say, well, you all have to be applied, and that's, just make the case and use it to highlight it, like you do here. Be proactive. And one thing I said yesterday when the opening of the academic year is that there's a lot of things happening in society, and we have to be honest. In the Netherlands, it's relatively okay, but across the world, there's a lot of voices who are basically against freedom of thinking, of freedom of movement of people, of movement of ideas. they are the thought police. And we should fight the thought police. And that means that this is a time not to sit still, but we should be proactive.
Yeah.
I see this as an attack of our body, and we should have an immune system. You know, you should be energized. We talked about, you know, what happened to economics when there's a financial crisis. Well, there's a wake-up call, right? What are we doing? I think this is what's happening in the world right now, is one gigantic wake-up call for, I would say, for the Enlightenment, for our search in knowledge. And so particular for young people, I think that means that we should be voice our concerns.
So we should use also different means that we have today to be able.
One thing I honestly feel is that, you know, and this is something that the academic world is very bad. If you say voicing your concern, engage people, how do we do this? We have a very limited repertoire. We give a lecture. Okay, we give a lecture. We write an opinion piece. Okay, we have been doing this for centuries. There are completely different ways, I feel, in which we can engage people. So are we also adventurous enough to explore this?
Yeah.
Can we think of different, like we can think of different laboratories, different mechanisms? Can we have creative solutions to kind of engage politicians, the public at large? And perhaps, you know, we think of startups, you know, new companies, etc. I think we need some kind of startups in public engagement too.
Our time is up,
yes.
But we want to thank you very much for coming here.
Is there a last statement you want to make? Is if we are able to have this immune system working, do these students then have a period of immense breakthroughs ahead of them?
Well, I said yesterday, well, the reason why you have infections and you have an immune system, you create antibodies. And antibodies are very important because they protect you for the next infection. And I think, you know, one way to what we should do as an academic community is immunize society against future attacks. So I think if we are more energized, we are looking in the future, we'll be safe, and we'll make sure that this wonderful institution of the university and scholarship, which has been so extremely successful over many centuries, has a glorious future for all of us.
So thank you all for coming. Next week we're going to have a special guest who is John de Mol on the 15th of September here on our podium. So we would like to invite you to come as well. Now give a warm round of applause for our guest here, Mr. Robbert Dijkgraaf.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Terrific. Yes.